When upon my fellow hill or tempest cross, when you are discouraged, thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done.
Very pleasant good morning to each and every one of you. I would encourage you to open up in your Bibles to Numbers, the 11th chapter. Numbers chapter 11 is where we're going to begin this morning. I appreciate the presence of everybody that is here. We do have a good number that is present with us, not only from our number that are now feeling better, able to be back with us, but also from visitors around the area, around the community, around the country. We're thankful that you've chosen to take time to be with us. We wish you a safe travel back. I'm sure that's because of the holiday weekend. We'll have more people of ours gone next week. We'll have visitors in next week as well, so this is definitely a time of transition for a lot of us. Appreciate also Dustin leading those songs. I did not ask him to pick songs that were specifically to the idea of murmuring, but I think he did a fantastic job with all that. Although I do have to reprimand him for his show of emotion. As we know here at Hillside, emotions are not allowed. You are not allowed to express any type of feeling of any kind, so I would ask him for further to please keep that for himself, or else he will be kindly asked to get out. Numbers chapter 11 is where we're going to begin this morning. I know it's not too cold yet, but we're quickly approaching the time period where we are going to get that brief 2-week window of colder weather for Dallas, which consists of anything below 150,000 degrees. And so I thought it would be a good time right now to bring about a public service announcement announcing the mild to moderate symptoms of hypothermia. If you're unfamiliar with hypothermia, it's a condition where your body tends to drop below the regulated temperature of 98.6 degrees, so you start to dip a little bit low. It's a permanent condition that you find yourself in, at least for the time being. It's not just merely a fluctuation. But some of the symptoms that you may find as you encounter somebody who is a victim of hypothermia is somebody may begin to mumble their words while they try to speak. They're not totally with it. They can't form sentences very well. They may fumble things that take minor coordination, writing or holding onto something. You see that sometimes whenever I tend to drop my clicker. You also may stumble lightly when you walk, maybe just kind of a little bit uneasy as you walk around from place to place. You may also complain about things such as vision loss or becoming too hot. And the important thing to keep in mind, at least for me, when you're talking about hypothermia, is that for most of the people, they're not really aware that they're hypothermic. Somebody who is undergoing hypothermia, whose body temperature is dropping, may encounter a lot of these symptoms, and it's not really known to them. So it's important for us to know the symptoms of mild and moderate hypothermia so that as we approach somebody who encounters these symptoms, we can help them, we can get them to a state of medical attention. That's your public service announcement concerning hypothermia. Now as I look out, I see a lot of people, especially Ken with that very specific scowl that he has, wondering why I'm discussing the idea of mild to moderate stage hypothermia. And that's because not only are those symptoms of hypothermia, but they also tend to be symptoms of the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness. Mumbling, stumbling, fumbling, and complaining seem to hallmark everything about these people to a T. And as you look not only at that brief period as soon as they entered Canaan in the first place, but especially that 40-year time period, you see sin after sin after sin after sin. And all of them stem from this idea of discontent. All of them stem from this idea of not being happy with the things that God has given to them. And like mild to moderate hypothermia, this was not something that these people were necessarily well aware of. God oftentimes has to remind these people, Moses has to remind these people, Aaron has to remind these people that you are complaining against God, and that's not something that you're supposed to do, especially to the person who makes bread drop from the sky for you. Complaining is not necessarily something that you should be a part of. When you look at the Israelites throughout the wilderness, you can see time after time after time that these people engage in all different types of complaining. For instance, before they left Egypt, before they'd even left Egypt, these were people that were already complaining, primarily in Exodus chapter 5, about all the different things that they now had to do. Now we've got to make bricks, but they're not giving us straw. You did that to us, Moses. After they left Egypt, when they got thirsty, then when they got hungry, when they got thirsty again, then when they got bored with the food that God gave them. In essence, I'm not happy that you're dropping food out of the sky. I'd really like something with a little kick to it, if you don't mind, God. That would really appreciate that as I wander throughout the desert. Then they obviously complained about Moses. This was specifically with Aaron and Miriam. Then when they got to Canaan, they didn't really like what they saw there either. They approached the doorstep of Canaan. They look off into the netherworld and they think to themselves, you know what, I think I'm good in the wilderness of Zin for right now. I think I'll just stay here for the time being. Then they wanted to eventually replace Moses. Then the leaders opposed Moses. We discussed that with Cora this morning in Bible class. Then when they believed Moses is wicked for whatever reason, then they still got thirsty a third time. You know, it's a recurring theme. And then finally, Numbers chapter 21, when they had just quite frankly had enough of God. They had enough of God. They had enough of Moses. They didn't care about any of this wandering anymore. They just wanted to turn around and go home. And it's very eye-opening to us. We obviously know that the Israelites complained, but it's very eye-opening when we look at all these different things, just how much they complained. It's almost as if Moses is embarking on the world's worst road trip, where all you have behind him is 2.5 million people asking constantly the question, are we there yet? I don't like McDonald's. I want Burger King. Can we please pull over because I just want to go run in the park for a couple hours? All the different complainings that people do. And so when you look at the Israelites, it's not just a state of constant sinfulness where they were just could not seem to get upright. But they were constantly discontent with the things that God has given to them. Numbers the 11th chapter, starting in verse 1, listen to how God characterizes this, or Moses rather characterizes this. Because this is Moses that is writing the record in Numbers. He says, now the people became like those who complained of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The very first phrase in that is not to be overlooked. Because when Moses says in Numbers chapter 11, starting verse 1, that these were people who were complaining as if they were complaining about adversity, the subtext of that is these were people that weren't going through adversity. These were not people that were encountering difficult trials. These were not people that were just having onslaught of opposition. They encountered warring tribes from time to time. They certainly encountered dissension within their own ranks. But these were not people that were undergoing some kind of magnanimous trial. And so in Numbers chapter 11, when he says that they complained as if they were having some kind of great adversity, God's response to them in the second half of verse 11, or verse 1 of chapter 11 is, the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and he started killing people. That's a very severe penalty for something that we would imagine is not really that serious. Verse 2, the people therefore cried out to Moses, as they so oftentimes did. Moses prayed to the Lord, as he so oftentimes did, and the fire eventually burned out. The name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. These were not a group of people that were happy with the way things were going. And whether you're talking about the nation of Israel as a whole, or whether you're talking about some factions within people that just kind of sprung up and started complaining about different things, the overall mentality as you look at the state of Israel in the wilderness is one of discontentment. These were people that didn't like the wilderness, didn't like Moses, didn't like the provisions. They did not like anything, and they let God know that. And we look at that and we think to ourselves, what a minor type of situation. It must have just got annoying. But God looks at it totally different. When you see his response there in chapter 11 and verse 1, when it says that he burned people on the outskirts of the camp, so much so that Moses had to then intercede for these people. It's a very serious allegation. And it merits a little bit of investigation on our part, not only as to what these people were complaining about, but in my opinion, most importantly, why they were complaining. If you look at, for instance, the very first one that we brought up on the screen, look at Exodus chapter 5. You have this complaint that people have, and I'm using this in the New American Brady version, this phrasing right here. Exodus chapter 5. What they were in essence complaining about is the idea that God is now making their life harder. I'm so sorry, God almost says, that in my quest to relieve you of your slavery in Egypt, that there's going to be a little bit of a pain along the way. In Exodus the 5th chapter, starting in verse 1, God encounters these people as Moses starts to interact with these people. Exodus chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, Afterward Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may celebrate to me a feast in the wilderness. This is the refrain that oftentimes Moses and Aaron would bring towards Pharaoh often. Verse 2, But Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I don't know the Lord. Besides, I'm not going to let Israel go. That's my workforce, 2.5 million slaves that are building me everything that I want to have. Verse 3, Then they said, The God of Hebrews has met with us. Please, let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Otherwise he will fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. The king of Egypt then said back to them in verse 4, Moses and Aaron, totally ignoring the request, Moses and Aaron, why do you draw away the people from their work? Get back to your labors. And again, Pharaoh said, Look, the people of the land are now many, and you would have them cease from the labors. And this isn't just a couple days off. This isn't as if they're trying to enforce better work labor laws. This is the total removal of an entire civilization of people that are building everything. And so Pharaoh says there in verse 5, the people of the land are many, and you would cease them from their labors. Verse 6, I'm going to teach them a lesson, Pharaoh says. The same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters over the people and their foremen, saying, you are no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and then gather straw for yourselves. But the quota of bricks which they were making previously, you shall impose on them. And you are not to reduce any of it, but because they are lazy. I love how Pharaoh just blames on these people. Therefore they cry out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let the labor be heavier on the men. Let them work at it, so that they will pay no attention to false words or these dreams that Moses and Aaron bring about. And so what you have here in this situation is Moses desperately trying to follow God's commandments by bringing these people out of their bondage. Pharaoh responds probably in the only way Pharaoh could, which is not only am I not going to let you go, I'm going to teach you a lesson in case you get any wild hairs about insurrection or rebellion. I'm going to teach you a lesson by doubling your work, making it harder, and by making it necessary that you require the provisions for that work in the first place. It's almost as if on your first day of job or on your 400,000th day job, whatever the situation is, you walk into the office and your boss comes up to you and he says, I don't really like the work that you're doing, but I want you to continue the same output. Oh, by the way, go buy your own computer. By the way, we're all sold out of computers at Best Buy. You got to go a couple towns over. You got to go buy your own computer, go buy your own desk, go buy your own software, set the software up, form your own departments, and then I still want you to maintain the same level of outputs. That's more or less what Pharaoh was asking for these Israelites to do. The Israelites respond in a way that obviously is very typical of them. They look back at Moses starting in verse 21, and they're very unhappy about this whole type of situation. Chapter 5, starting in verse 21, it says, they said, and may the Lord look upon you and judge you, for you have made us odious in Pharaoh's sight and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. Notice Moses' response here in verse 22. Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done harm to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. The very first complaint that the people give to Moses, which Moses is probably assuming that this is not typical of these people for whatever reason, the very first complaint that the people give towards Moses is, you've made our life harder. You've made everything worse than it should have been. And Moses responds accordingly. He goes to God and he says, look, you've told me to do this thing, I've done this, and all it's done is result in bad for these people. And what they missed in this whole scheme, what all these people missed in the entire scheme of this, is what was going to be at the end of all of this. What they missed between Moses and God for the whole genesis of this situation in the first place was he was trying to free them from slavery. Never mind the fact that you had bricks to make. Never mind that you had to go collect straw. They were obsessed with the idea that their current situation was made harder, totally blind to the end result of all these actions in the first place. And I think sometimes in our own walk with God, we get blind to what God is trying to do for us as well. When we talk about salvation, we talk about heaven that's out there and the life that we eventually will live with Him forever. That's all fine and good. This world is hard. It's filled with removing temptation. It's filled with battling circumstances. It's filled with telling people things that necessarily they may not want to know. Correcting your brethren when they sin. Correcting people when they sin outside the church. And it is a hard task for us to do. And sometimes it's easier for us to look at God and say, look, I'm glad about heaven. I like that that's out there. But my current situation, you've just messed it all up. And so in order to not do that, I'm just going to kind of stay in slavery for a little while. I'm just going to stay emboldened and enslaved in the situation that I am currently right now, even though it's detrimental to who I am, in order to just kind of make things easier for me in the short term. For instance, if you're somebody who, I'm speaking once again to myself, but if you're somebody who's trying to lose weight, 215 right now, want to get down to 205, I'm trying to get to where Casey's average jogging 1 billion miles a day, not there yet, but trying to get down to 205. And I will tell you, one of the hardest things for me at least to do is to give up my 8 times a week Taco Bell habit. Lena hates it, but to give up my 8 times a week Taco Bell habits. That's obviously an exaggeration. Everybody thought it was serious. That kind of alarms me there. But I will tell you that in the end of all of this, if I can get rid of the junk food, if I can get myself in shape and start actually jogging like Casey has been trying to tell me to do, which he hasn't been, but he should, then I know the end result of that will be worth it. The hard part is, I don't want to do that now. I don't want to get the straw and make the bricks now to go along with God's plan for what will eventually happen. Paul in the book of Romans discusses the same type of idea, and he picks his words very carefully, I think, when he discusses this idea specifically. In Romans chapter 6, starting in verse 12, Paul discusses this idea. Here's the key word of slavery. Romans chapter 6, starting in verse 12. Paul tells the church here, he talks about this whole thing in the discussion about the idea of grace and the idea about sin in the first place, and whether or not grace just kind of has this continual cleansing, you can do whatever you want to. Paul is very much opposite of that idea as he discusses in this section about the necessity to remove sin from your life. In Romans chapter 6, starting verse 12, listen to what he says here. He says, "Therefore do not let Satan reign in your mortal body so that you obey its lusts. Do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law but under grace." You can effectively file Romans chapter 6, verses 12 through 14 under the category of easier said than done. Because if I were to take a big straw poll of everyone here, I would say that probably almost every single one of us this morning, this instant, is battling some kind of sin. And I don't know what it is. It's probably best that I don't know, especially if you don't know what my sin is. But all of us here have temptations in our life that are very specific to us, or maybe the application is specific to us. And because of that, we just find it really hard to give up. And we'll give up 99% of the other stuff. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with this. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. But that one, that's the one that I do have a problem with. And to remove that from who I am is to rip a piece out of my soul. It's to take away my identity, more or less. And because of that, I don't want to give that up. And yet what Paul says here in Romans chapter 6 is, those things that you're enslaved to, in case you don't think that you're enslaved to them, you are enslaved to them. As he mentions in verses 12 to 14, you have to give those things up. As he continues on here in verse 15, he says, "What then? Shall we sin because we're not under law but under grace? May never be. Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves to obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death or obedience resulting in righteousness?" Ask yourself that question. Because most of us, as we travel through the world, we're not aware of the fact that the things that we tend to engage in that we know we're sinful, we're slaves of those things. And if you don't think you're slaves of those things, ask yourself how easy it is to remove yourself from that situation, or from that activity, or from that work, or whatever it is that you're having trouble with. And you'll find out very quickly, just how enslaved we are to that circumstance. Verse 17, here's the grace. "Thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to where you're committed, and having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness. I am speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. For just as you presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, resulting in further lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, resulting in sanctification." The Israelites were oblivious to Canaan. The only thing they could see was the straw, was the bricks, and all the things that made their life harder in the short term. They were completely oblivious to what that all was in the first place. And they cried out to Moses, and they cried out to God, complaining that God had made their life harder. And it's easy for us when we think about removing certain things in our life to cry out to God to say, this burden is greater than I can bear. And in reality, we're no different than the Israelites, who complain about straw and miss Canaan. You can also look at another instance where they complain in Exodus chapter 15, where they very honestly, I think very honestly, at least in this regard, said, God quite frankly doesn't care about me. If I were to do another straw poll, I would say probably all of us have felt like this at some point in our lives, that God just for whatever reason does not care about me, doesn't want me to live, doesn't care about my well-being, which is the essence of the first sin in Genesis chapter 3. He knows that you can eat of the tree and you'll be like him. He just doesn't want you to. And what happens in Exodus chapter 15 is the first of three instances where physical provisions are on the table. And the people cry out to God, claiming that He's not feeding them, not giving them the basic necessities of life. And immediately after the greatest song in the book of Exodus, the Song of Moses there in Exodus chapter 15, 1 through 21, which I think is one of the greatest songs in the Old Testament. Exodus chapter 15, starting verse 22, it says, Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness, and they still found no water. But when they came to Marah, they couldn't drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter, therefore it was named Marah. Therefore the people grumbled at Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Then he cried out to the Lord showed him a tree. He threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. If you look in chapter 16, you have this instance where people are crying out to God that you're not feeding us. And so what does God do? He literally rains food from the sky. You go to chapter 17. And the people once again cry out the fact that all of a sudden they can't drink any water anymore. There's nothing there to refresh their souls. So what does God do? He commands Moses to hit a rock. I think speaking comes later. Hits the rock, and water just pours forth from it. What you have in essence are 3 back-to-back miracles of God providing sustenance for these people. And yet all of them come as a result of the people crying out to God. You don't care about me. You're not giving me the things that I need necessary to survive. There's so many things wrong, especially when you look at chapter 17. Look at chapter 17. There's so many things wrong with this picture. Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17, starting in verse 2. Exodus chapter 17, starting in verse 2. It says, therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? That's strike 1. But the people, verse 3, thirsted there for water. They grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? In other words, accusing God of cruelty. That's strike 2. Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, what shall I do to this people? Oh, Lord, they're going to stone me. The Lord said to Moses, pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go, and behold, I will stand before you there at the rock of Horeb. You shall strike the rock, water will come out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of all the elders of Israel. And the accusation there is in verse 7. He named the place Massa and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel, and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? If you continue down, especially if you look in chapter 16, whenever you're talking about the food that's fallen from the sky. And then you look in chapter 17 about how now God is giving them more food with the condition that they don't gather more than what they need for the day. It presents a lack of faith when they look at the food and they say, well, I don't trust God, so I'm going to take 2 days worth of provisions because after all, God may not give us food tomorrow. And it represents a distinct lack of faith in what God has given them. And it represents a distinct lack of faith in the idea that God can even provide for them in the first place. And the underlying issue here is not that God's not going to provide for these people. The underlying issue is that they don't like the way that God has provided for these people. That's really the catch with all of this. They look at the food that falls from the sky. They look at the water that comes out of the rock. And they look back at the wafers, the manna, and they say, stale. It's something else. I really love M&M's, God. If you could rain some M&M's down from the sky, it'd be fantastic. I could really go, God, right now for a big, fat sirloin steak just right here from me. Make that rain down from the sky. It wasn't about the fact that God wasn't providing for them. It was 100% about the fact that they did not like the way that God was providing for them. They didn't like the manna. They didn't like the food. They didn't like the water. I think we're like that a lot too. If you look in the book of Matthew, if you remember whenever Jesus is sitting with Matthew the tax collector, and he's sitting there with who would eventually become one of his 12 apostles. And Matthew the tax collector is sitting in there, and the Pharisees are watching this whole scene unfold, and they look at this and they say to themselves, can't believe he's eating with tax collectors. Ugh. We don't even like tax collectors in today's world. My apologies to anybody that works for the IRS. We don't even like tax collectors in today's world. I can't believe the Son of God, who claims to be holy, is associating with this person. Ugh. Do you remember what Jesus' statement is on the back end? It says, it's not the healthy that need a physician, but it's the sick. They didn't like the fact that the Son of God came down and aligned himself with who they viewed as the lower strata of society. To them, the Son of God should obviously hobnob with the greatest. They like salvation. They want it on their terms. We love heaven. We love salvation. We love, on some levels, repentance. We love prayer. We want it all on our terms. Don't ask me if I need to repent. Don't ask me to repent of that. If I need to make something right, don't ask me to make it right with Nathan. I don't want to make things right with Nathan. I like that we're at odds with each other right now as he stares a hole through me. I like that tension. I want salvation, I want heaven, I want godliness, I want righteousness, I want intimacy with God, but I want it on my terms. That was the problem with all this thing. And also, when they finally got to Canaan, looked at the situation and said, well, this is just impossible. Numbers chapter 14. It's hard for me to wrap my mind around this scenario. And granted, the 40 years of wandering didn't happen until after this situation. But Numbers chapter 14, starting in verse 2. These are people that are on the doorstep of Canaan. And it's hard for me to overstate this. You can't overstate this, at least in my mind, because when you look at this situation, these are people that were taken out of slavery in Egypt, marched across the Red Sea, sat at the base of Mount Sinai, now wandered through the wilderness to the doorstep of Canaan a matter of 2 or 3 months later. And they're sitting literally on the precipice of their hope and of their dream. And the only thing they can look at is how big the Canaanites are. Numbers chapter 14, starting verse 2. All the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us into this land to then fall by the sword? Our lives, our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, that's a fantastic idea. Let us appoint a leader and return back to Egypt. These are people that look at the precipice of their hope, right at the edge of their glory, and then fall back out of cowardice, despite the fact that everything they've seen. They look at the Mount Sinai experience, they look at the food falling from the sky, they look at the parting of the Red Sea, and they look at a 7'2" Canaanite with a huge sword, and they think, well, that's impossible for God. And in case you think that mentality ever skipped a generation or just went away by any point, when you fast forward a few hundred years and see the reaction of Israel at Goliath, the same mentality is still there. That there's nothing we can do because this guy is just gigantic. Probably bigger than Scott's. I can't take that guy. Can you imagine being that close to glory? Can you imagine being that close to Canaan and shrinking away because of your cowardice? I have a weird fascination, and I don't understand it, but I have a weird fascination with Mountain Everest. I probably will never climb Everest. I'm not allowed to. My life insurance doesn't matter. But probably will never climb Mount Everest. It's far beyond my capabilities. I can barely climb stairs because I'm scared of heights, but probably will never climb Everest. But one of the things I know about Everest is that it sits 27,000 feet up above sea level. And every 100 meters you go up, it drops a degree Celsius, or half a degree Celsius. So that by the time you get to what's known as the death zone, which is that area right below the summit, that last little climb right before you reach that summit, that area known as the death zone, right up into there, you're dealing with extreme cold. You're dealing with weather that's negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You're dealing with a storm that can arise out of nowhere. And you're dealing with a very technical climb. Not really technically, but because of the massive amounts of gear and because of the sheer height and the oxygen you're dealing with, it makes it very tough. But as you're going up the South Summit, and if you've made it up that far, you're already top 10, at least in my book. But as you go all the way up to the South Summit, what you inevitably see right towards the end is what's known as the Hillary Step. It's known for Edmund Hillary, called in honor of Edmund Hillary, the first guy to summit Everest. And as you look at this Hillary Step, it is a very technical climb because it's about 30 to 40 feet up a sheer rock face. And there's a way that you can get up. If it was at sea level, you didn't have all that equipment, it'd be one thing. But when you've got 100, 150 pounds of gear, you're 27,000 feet up in the air, you can literally see Mars away as you look out across the horizon. It makes it very challenging. Let me tell you what nobody does when they get to Hillary Step. Not one person, that at least I know of, and I actually looked this up because I was curious about this, not one person who has made it up to the death zone looks at the Hillary Step, says, you know what, I'm good, I'm just going to go home. Because by the time you've gotten to that point in the first place, you have encountered so much opposition and you have done so many tough things to get there that the Hillary Step is hard, but if you've done all the other stuff, you're going to get there. And that's what I think about when I see this instance here in Numbers chapter 14, about all these people that have done and seen amazing things, that have crossed inordinate circumstances. And they get to the doorstep of Canaan and they bow out because they're afraid. And then they complain to God that He's asking them to do something that's impossible. Never mind the fact that they had already done several impossible things, at least in human terms, by crossing the Red Sea, by seeing Mount Sinai, by having food fall from the sky. And yet our lack of faith in God causes us to cry out to Him. When you look at John the 6th chapter, you look at the way the story unfolds. It's the exact same thing except in much less drastic terms. And in John chapter 6, starting in verse 60, after Jesus has walked in the water, after He's fed the 5,000, Jesus in John the 6th chapter, starting in verse 60, starts talking about things that are, at least in my opinion, a little bit hard to understand. Their opinion probably as well. But in John chapter 6, starting in verse 60, it says, therefore, many of His disciples, when they heard this, they started talking about the bread of life. Who can then listen to it? And Jesus, conscious that His disciples grumbled, said to them, does this cause you to stumble? What then if you see the Son of Man ascending to where He was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I've spoken to you are spirit and life, but there are some of you who don't believe. That's a very telling phrase for what happens in verse 66, when it says, as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. There's one word as you look at 60 through 66 that I really want to key in on, and it's that word disciple. These were not people that were stragglers. The bulk of what he's dealing with here in John chapter 6 are not people that saw Jesus from afar and kind of wandered out in the wilderness to see what was going on. These were people that identified with his teachings and identified with who he was. And yet when the teaching got a little bit difficult for them, instead of learning more about it, they simply backed off and went back to their villages. And as Jesus turns around in verse 67 and looks at his disciples and says, are you going to go somewhere too? The apostles in essence look back at Jesus and say, nowhere else we can go. For you alone have the words of life. John chapter 7, starting in verse 10, when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as if in secret. And the Jews were seeking him at the feast and were saying, where is he? And there was much grumbling about the crowds concerning him, and some were saying, he's a good man. Others were saying, no, on the contrary, he leads the people astray. And yet no one was speaking openly for him for fear of the Jews. We look at Jesus and we look at his salvation. We look at the things that he asks us to know and to do, and we respond in the same way that the Israelites did. It is impossible. And never mind that we have 66 books that testify to the opposite. When we think about repenting of our sins and standing up to tribulation, by correcting things in our life, by evangelizing in his name, that's impossible. And we're no different than the Israelites at the doorstep of Canaan. When we look at the very inconvenient obstacle in front of us, and abandon the entire mission, and then blame God for it, because he's asked us to do something that, quite frankly, we don't think we're capable of. Top it all up in Numbers chapter 16, there are people just turn out like the leaders. By this point in Numbers chapter 16, you have two instances, chapter 16, chapter 21, where the people rise up against Moses with Korah in Numbers chapter 16, and they eventually rise up in Numbers chapter 21 against God. They're done with him, they're done with Moses, they're done with everybody. And at this point, that's when they say, let's return, or it's appointed leader, let's return back to Egypt, let's go back there. And it's nowhere that in both of these situations, and this doesn't happen, with the exception of Numbers chapter 11, to my knowledge, this doesn't happen except in these two instances where God sends things to kill them. He sends plagues, or he sends the snakes in chapter 21. Chapter 16, he opens up the entire world, and Korah and his followers fall down into twins. And from this point forward, starting in chapter 21, you do not see people complaining about God really anymore. But these were people that had run out of things to complain about. God had given them food, God had given them water, he had given them everything that they needed to survive. They just quite frankly didn't like the leaders. And didn't like the way things were going. They were going to complain about everything. And we know people like this. We know people like this that have nothing else to do in this world except complain. People that don't want to solve problems, people that don't want to rally the troops, people that don't want to contribute to the situation. They would sit in the back, they want to complain. By the way, it's not slam when anybody sits in the back. Those sit in the back, metaphorically speaking, armchair everything, complain about whatever. And if they don't like the outcome, let's just appoint a leader and return back to Egypt. I like how one person responded to this. They said, did you ever notice that the one who complains about the way that the ball bounces is usually the one that dropped the ball in the first place? I think that's very telling of some of these people. In this instance, it wasn't Moses' fault that they didn't enter Canaan. That's the ironic part of all of this. It wasn't Moses' fault that these people didn't enter Canaan. It was their fault. But because they couldn't wrap their minds around it, they blamed Moses, they blamed God, and they wanted to return back to Egypt. Philippians chapter 2, let's look at this one last verse. Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 14. Paul writes to the church at Philippi, do all things without grumbling or dispute, so that you will prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation among whom you appear as lights of the world, holding fast to the word of life. So in the day of Christ I will have reason to glory, because I did not run or toil in vain. What Paul asked the church at Philippi to do in this instance is to not complain, to not look at the salvation that's right in front of you and start complaining about this. Because the one thing that 1 Peter 3 and verse 15 talks about, that we should tell people when they ask us about the hope that is in us, is I cannot wait to be with God. I cannot wait to be with Him in that moment of glory. And yeah, the things that I'll go through in this earth may be tough, but they pale in comparison to what I will eventually attain once I get there. And as he mentions in Philippians chapter 2, do all things without grumbling, do all things without complaining, because what that indicates to most people is a blatant lack of faith, a lack of contentment with what God has given to us, and an unhappiness with the problems that He's brought to us. This week, as most of us are familiar with, is Thanksgiving. And as you sit around your table or your tables or whatever the situation is, and you have your feast laid before you, you'll probably do what my family has recently started doing within the last 5 or 6 years with my dad's idea, which I love. It's sometimes awkward the longer it gets around the table and you can't repeat things. But you'll start to identify the things that you're thankful for. And one person will say this, another person will say this, another person will say that. And we'll talk about all the things that we're thankful about in our life. And I think that's fair and great. I think as we sung this morning, we need to count our many blessings, and it will surprise us what God has done for us. But what I don't want us to forget about ever is where those blessings came from in the first place. The reason we have our health, our employment, our families, our life, our society, our standing, whatever the situation is, the reason we have what we have today, whatever that is because of what God's given to us. So as you count your blessings, as you name them one by one, don't forget where all those blessings come from in the first place. The spirit of discontentment stems from the belief or from the forgetfulness of where those blessings came from. Unless we complain like the Israelites, of whom many were annihilated in a single city, let's always hold fast the promises that God has given to us. Count them every single day. If you have need of the gospel call, we can help you with anything.
When upon my fellow hill or children's cross, when you are discouraged, thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them